June 1944. A naval battle unlike any other was unfolding across the Pacific. But the greatest threat to the Japanese refugees huddling in caves across Saipan wasn't coming from American bullets. It was invisible, it was crawling, and it was killing faster than any weapon ever could. This is the story of how one moment changed everything. A moment that looked like violation, but was actually salvation. A moment between a young woman and a soldier that neither of them would ever fully understand until years had passed. This is the story of Tomo and Sergeant Edward Mitchell. The island of Saipan was a nightmare. The Battle of Saipan had raged for weeks, transforming the beautiful Pacific island into a hellscape of violence, desperation, and unspeakable suffering. By June 1944, tens of thousands of Japanese civilians had fled their homes and were hiding in caves throughout the island, terrified of what they believed awaited them if they surrendered to the American forces. They had been told horrific stories. They had been warned by their government. They had been told that surrender meant death, shame, violation, the complete annihilation of everything they held sacred. So they hid. They huddled together in the darkness of caves, in cellars, in underground bunkers carved into volcanic rock. Parents held their children close and whispered reassurances they didn't believe. Grandmothers prayed to ancestors they hoped could protect them. Teenagers clung to each other in the darkness, wondering if they would ever see sunlight again. Everyone waited. Everyone feared. Everyone listened to the sounds of bombardment echoing through the stone around them, never knowing if the next explosion would collapse their refuge and bury them alive. For weeks, they endured. They rationed water from underground springs. They ate nothing or almost nothing. They listened to screams outside the cave entrances. They heard gunfire. They heard voices shouting in English. They heard the sounds of civilization being destroyed around them. Some of them didn't make it. Some died of starvation. Some died of dehydration. Some died from their injuries, bleeding out in the darkness. Their families unable to do anything but hold them as they slipped away. And through it all, they clung to their fear of capture, their conviction that American soldiers would do unspeakable things to them, their belief that it was better to die in the darkness than to surrender to the enemy. But the Japanese weren't the only ones observing the refugees. American soldiers, medics, and officers were watching them too. They were watching from the surface, from behind barricades, from medical stations hastily constructed in the rubble of what used to be Japanese military installations. But they weren't watching out of malice. They weren't searching for revenge or retribution. They were watching because something far deadlier than bullets was spreading through the refugee populations, something invisible, something that traveled through clothing and skin contact, something that killed without discrimination, without mercy, without regard for age, gender, military status, or innocence. Typhus. The disease was ravaging the island. Military doctors, men like Dr. Samuel Cohen, had begun noticing a pattern in the casualty reports. The refugee camps were becoming death zones. People who surrendered were arriving malnourished, injured, traumatized, and infected. The lice were everywhere. They infested the clothing, the blankets, the hair, the skin of everyone who had been hiding in those caves for weeks. And with every louse came the risk of transmission. Typhus was a death sentence in 1944. There were no antibiotics. There was no cure. There was only prevention. And prevention meant one thing: delousing, immediate delousing, complete delousing. Delousing whether the refugees understood it or agreed to it. Dr. Samuel Cohen was the senior medical officer assigned to process the refugees arriving on Saipan. He was a man in his 40s, a doctor who had spent the last 3 years watching humanity at its absolute worst. He had seen gunshot wounds that had turned gangrenous. He had seen soldiers die from sepsis. He had seen children expire from diseases that in peacetime would have been manageable. He had held the hands of men, women, and children as typhus ravaged their bodies, as fever consumed them, as their organs shut down one by one. He understood the mathematics of the crisis. It was brutal and unforgiving. For every refugee who wasn't deloused, 10 more could become infected. For every day the delousing was delayed, the death toll climbed exponentially. The math was brutal. The solution was urgent. And the solution was the new weapon the military had recently acquired and deployed to the Pacific: DDT. DDT. Dichlorodiphene Eltric chloroethane. a powdered insecticide that had been synthesized just years earlier in Switzerland. The American military had only recently begun distributing it to frontline units. It was effective beyond anything they had seen before. It killed lice on contact. It killed fleas. It killed mosquitoes. It was hailed as a miracle cure, a scientific achievement that would save thousands of lives. But there was a problem, a serious problem. Clothes harbored the insects. Skin harbored them. Hair harbored them. The only way to fully delouse someone was to remove their clothing, spray them head to toe with the powder, wait for the powder to do its work, and provide them with clean garments. And in 1944, on an island still scarred by battle, still echoing with the sounds of recent violence, asking a Japanese woman to remove her clothing in front of an American soldier was asking her to do something that every fiber of her being screamed against. It was asking her to violate her culture, her religion, her sense of modesty, her survival instincts that had kept her alive through 17 days in a cave, which is where Tomo came in. Tomo was 23 years old. She had been born on Saipan. Her family had lived on the island for generations. They owned a small textile business near the harbor. Her father had died when she was 17, and since then, she had worked alongside her mother, learning the business, learning the craft, learning how to survive in a world that was becoming increasingly militarized. When the war came to Saipan, when American forces began their approach to the island, Tomoe and her mother had debated what to do. Stay and hope for the best or flee to the countryside. They had chosen to flee. They had hidden in a cave that her mother's cousin had shown them, a cave carved into the volcanic rock in the hills behind the town. She had survived the battle by hiding in that cave with her mother for 17 days. 17 days without sunlight, 17 days without proper food, 17 days of rationing water from a small underground spring, 17 days of listening to the sounds of artillery bombardment echoing through the stone above them. She had rationed water so carefully that her lips had become cracked and bleeding. They had eaten nothing, or almost nothing, surviving on leaves they had brought with them and insects they had found in the darkness. She had listened to her mother's prayers, whispered again and again in the darkness, begging ancestors for protection, for survival, for mercy. She had held her mother's hand in the dark and tried not to cry, tried not to scream, tried not to give in to the terror that threatened to overwhelm her every moment of every day. When the cave entrance finally collapsed from artillery fire, a massive explosion that filled the cave with dust and stones and the smell of explosives, they had thought they would die together. Tomoe had believed, in that moment, that this was the end, that they would be buried alive in the darkness, that their bodies would never be found, that her mother's prayers would go unanswered. But American soldiers had heard them calling out from beneath the rubble. They had heard the muffled sounds of women crying. They had heard the desperation in those voices, and they had begun to dig. They had dug through the rubble, stone by stone, with their bare hands and with tools they had fashioned from debris. They had worked for hours. And finally, they had pulled Tomoe and her mother from the darkness. And now, after 17 days of hiding, being pulled from a cave, walking in the daylight for the first time in more than 2 weeks, Tomoe was standing in the light for the first time in weeks. Her eyes couldn't adjust to the brightness. She squinted against the sun. She felt dizzy. She felt weak. She could barely stand. American soldiers were around her. They were speaking to her in English, a language she didn't understand. They were gesturing, they were pointing. They were separating her from her mother, and she was terrified. Her clothing was filthy. Her skin was covered in welts and bites from the lice that had infested every inch of her body. Her hair was matted with dirt and sweat, and she was itching, constantly itching. The lice were eating her alive, literally. She could feel them crawling on her skin. She could feel them in her hair. She could feel them everywhere, but she didn't know what they were. She didn't know that they were the carriers of a disease that would kill her within weeks if they weren't removed. She didn't understand what was happening. She didn't understand English. She didn't understand why the American soldiers were separating her from her mother. She didn't understand why they were pointing and shouting and gesturing at her to remove her clothes. All she knew was fear. All she could feel was the certainty that the stories she had been told were coming true. The stories about what American soldiers did to Japanese women. The stories her mother had whispered to her as they hid in the cave. The stories that had made her promise that she would never allow herself to be captured alive. The stories that had made her mother press a small vial of poison into her hand, just in case, with tears streaming down her face. All she knew was that this was the moment she had been dreading since the battle began. Sergeant Edward Mitchell had been a medic for 3 years. He was 26 years old. He had enlisted after Pearl Harbor, driven by anger and patriotism and a genuine desire to help. He had served in Europe, in North Africa, in Sicily. He had seen disease, trauma, and desperation on a scale that had fundamentally changed how he understood the world. He had seen soldiers die from infections that could have been prevented with better sanitation. He had seen soldiers go mad from shell shock. He had seen soldiers kill themselves rather than face capture. And he had learned that war was not about heroism or glory. War was about survival. War was about doing what needed to be done, regardless of how it made you feel. When he was reassigned to the Pacific, to Saipan specifically, to help process the refugee population and implement the new DDT delousing protocols, he had thought he was ready. He had thought he understood what disease looked like. He had thought he was prepared for the sight of suffering. He wasn't. Nothing could have prepared him for this. The refugees were arriving in waves. Hundreds of them, thousands. Some were sick, some were dying. Some were walking skeletons, their bodies consumed by starvation and disease, and all of them were infested. All of them carried lice in their clothing, in their hair, on their skin. All of them were potential vectors for typhus. Edward had been trained in the new DDT protocol. He had been trained by military doctors who explained to him in clinical terms what typhus did to the human body. He had been shown photographs of typhus victims. He understood the science. He understood the urgency. What he wasn't prepared for was the human element. What he wasn't prepared for was the depth of trauma he would see in the eyes of people who had just survived a battle, people who had been hiding in caves for weeks, people who had been told their entire lives that American soldiers were monsters. He wasn't prepared for a young woman to look at him with terror in her eyes as he ordered her to remove her clothes. He wasn't prepared to be the instrument of her trauma, even if that trauma was a misunderstanding, even if his intentions were to save her life, even if every medical officer on the island knew that delousing had to happen immediately, had to happen to everyone, had to happen whether they understood it or agreed to it. But there was no time for explanation. There was no time for gentleness. Dr. Cohen had been clear in his briefings. The delousing had to happen immediately. The disease was spreading. Lives were at stake. Thousands of lives. And so when Tomo was brought to the delousing station, when she was told in harsh, commanding tones to remove her garments, she began to cry. Her whole body began to shake. She began to pray in Japanese, whispering prayers to Amaterasu, the sun goddess, to the ancestors, to anyone who might hear her and help her. Her mother, who had been separated from her moments before to undergo her own delousing, began to scream. She screamed her daughter's name. She screamed prayers. She screamed warnings. She screamed accusations at the American soldiers. Tomoe clung to her clothing with every ounce of strength she possessed. She looked at her mother, and she saw her mother's face filled with a mother's terror for her child, and she felt something break inside her. Edward felt his heart breaking. He could see the terror in Tomo's eyes. He could see the way her hands were shaking. He could hear her mother screaming in the distance. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him. But he also understood something that Tomo couldn't. He understood that her lice were death, not metaphorically, literally. He understood that in 3 weeks she would begin to develop symptoms of typhus if they weren't removed. He understood that in 6 weeks, if she didn't get medical care, she would likely be dead. He understood that the fever would consume her, that her organs would shut down, that she would spend her final days screaming in agony as the disease ravaged her body from the inside out. And he was the only thing standing between her and that fate. So he took a breath. He kept his voice firm. He gestured again, more emphatically this time. Remove the clothing. Now. It wasn't cruel. It was medical necessity. It was the difference between life and death. But Tomo didn't know that. All she knew was that an American soldier was ordering her to remove her clothing. Tomo's hands shook as she reached for her kimono. Tears streamed down her face. She was whispering prayers in Japanese. She was saying goodbye to her dignity, or so she thought. She was saying goodbye to her life as she had known it. She was saying goodbye to the belief that the world made sense, that there was justice, that good things happen to good people. Her mother's screams echoed in the distance, growing more frantic, more desperate. Everything in her was screaming to run, to resist, to fight. But she was exhausted. She was traumatized. She had survived 17 days in a cave by obeying orders, by staying quiet, by doing what she was told. And so she obeyed. The kimono fell to the ground. Edward Mitchell picked up the DDT dispenser. It looked like a weapon. It was shaped like a gun. But instead of bullets, it sprayed powder. White powder. The powder covered his hands as he adjusted it, getting a feel for the trigger mechanism, making sure it was working properly. He had done this 43 times in the past 6 hours. This would be the 44th. But this time was different. This time he looked into the eyes of the woman in front of him and he saw something that broke through the protocol. The urgency. The mathematics of disease prevention. He saw a human being. He saw a person who had survived a battle. Survived 17 days in a cave, survived bombardment, starvation, and terror. He saw someone's daughter. Someone's sister. Someone who had done nothing wrong except be born in the wrong place at the wrong time. He saw a young woman standing in front of him, naked and terrified, and he was about to further violate her autonomy in the name of saving her life. He was about to do something that would haunt her for years, something that would shape her understanding of the world and of men and of power and of violation. The unfairness of it struck him like a physical blow. He wanted to explain. He wanted to tell her that this was medicine. He wanted to tell her that the powder would save her life. He wanted to tell her that he was not going to harm her. He wanted to tell her that in a few months the war would be over, and she would be able to rebuild her life and none of this would matter. He wanted to tell her that he understood her fear, that he respected her, that he hated being the instrument of her trauma, but there was no time to process it. There was no time to apologize. There was no time to explain, because the clock was ticking. The disease was spreading. And Edward had learned long ago that in war, you don't have the luxury of perfect solutions. You have the luxury of surviving. And sometimes survival looks ugly. Sometimes survival requires you to do things that feel wrong, even when you know they're necessary. Sometimes survival requires you to violate someone's dignity in order to save their life. He raised the DDT dispenser. Tomoe closed her eyes. What happened next would stay with her for the rest of her life, but not in the way she expected. Edward began to spray. The white powder fell like snow across her shoulders. It covered her hair. It fell down her back, her arms, her legs. It coated every inch of her exposed skin. The powder was cool. It smelled chemical and strange. It wasn't painful, but it was humiliating. She kept her eyes closed. She kept praying. She imagined that this was the moment the stories had warned her about. This was the violation. This was the reason her mother had told her to run into the cave and never come out. This was the moment that she had feared since the day the war came to Saipan. But nothing happened. No hands reached for her. No advances were made. No further trauma followed. Just the sound of the spray. Just the sensation of powder covering her skin. Just the chemical smell and the cool sensation and the overwhelming sense of humiliation and violation. And as her eyes slowly opened, she saw something that made her confusion deepen. The soldier's face was serious, determined, professional. He was looking past her. He wasn't looking at her body. He was looking through her, at an enemy that was invisible to her but crystal clear to him. He was looking at the lice that were crawling on her skin. He was looking at the disease that was infecting her. He was looking at death itself, and he was fighting it with the only weapon he had available. The delousing lasted 3 minutes. 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours. 3 minutes in which she stood naked and covered in white powder, feeling humiliated and terrified and confused. 3 minutes in which she wondered if this was really happening, if this was really the future she had feared, if the world had truly become as cruel and as senseless as it now appeared to be. 3 minutes in which her mother's screams slowly began to fade, suggesting that her mother was undergoing the same process, or perhaps had already finished. Or perhaps had given up screaming because she too had realized that screaming would not change what was happening. When it was finished, Edward gestured to a table where fresh clothing had been laid out. American military issue. Clean. Unused. Khaki pants. A shirt. Undergarments. Socks. Shoes. Items that had never been worn before. That had been brought to Saipan specifically for the refugees. He said something in English that Tomo couldn't understand. But his tone was different now. It wasn't harsh. It was almost gentle. He helped her into the clothing. His hands never touched her skin. He was professional. He was kind. He was, she began to realize, trying to help her. Or was he? She still didn't understand. She still didn't know what had just happened or why it had happened. All she knew was that she was no longer naked. All she knew was that someone cared enough to dress her in clean clothing. All she knew was that the soldier had not hurt her, had not violated her in any of the ways she had feared. As the fresh clothing settled on her body, something shifted in Tomo's understanding. The powder was still on her skin. It was still making her itch slightly. But the itch was different now. It felt like relief. It felt like something had changed fundamentally in her body. It felt like the parasites that had been eating her alive were dying. She could feel it, as if her skin was waking up from a nightmare, as if something that had been wrong was being made right. Edward walked her to the next station where her mother was waiting. Her mother took one look at her daughter, clean, clothed, covered in white powder, alive, and began to cry, but not tears of grief, tears of understanding, because she had just undergone the same process. She understood now what the soldier had done. She understood that there had been no violation. She understood that there had been no assault. She understood that there had been salvation. And as she looked at her daughter, as she took in her clean clothing, as she saw the white powder still clinging to her skin, she understood that her daughter had been given a gift that looked like violation, but was actually mercy. The two women embraced, and Tomo felt something she hadn't felt in weeks: hope. In the hours and days that followed, Tomo began to understand what had happened. Military doctors explained to her, through interpreters, what DDT was, what typhus was, how the disease spread, how the delousing would save her life, how many people had already died from typhus in the camps, how many more would die if delousing protocols weren't implemented immediately. Slowly, gradually, she began to comprehend that the soldier hadn't been trying to violate her. He had been trying to save her. The Battle of Saipan had been one of the deadliest in the Pacific War. American forces had landed on June 15, 1944, and the battle had raged for 25 days. The fighting had been brutal, house to house, cave to cave, with Japanese soldiers making last stands in positions that they knew were already lost. Over 3,400 American soldiers had been killed in the battle. Over 29,000 Japanese soldiers had been killed, but the hidden cost had been the civilians. Approximately 10,000 Japanese civilians had died during the battle, some in the crossfire, some by their own hands, jumping from cliffs because they believed the propaganda about American treatment of prisoners, some from starvation and dehydration as they hid in caves, and some from disease, so many from disease. The refugee camps that formed after the battle quickly became vectors for disease. Typhus, spread by lice living in unwashed clothing, became the #1 killer in the camps. More people died from typhus than from combat-related injuries. The military understood this. Military strategists understood that if they didn't implement delousing protocols immediately, the death toll from disease would exceed the death toll from combat. Dr. Samuel Cohen understood this. He had seen too many people die from preventable diseases. And a new soldier named Edward Mitchell, who had been trained in the new delousing protocol, understood this. He understood that every person he deloused was a life saved. He understood that the trauma of the delousing, while real and significant, was necessary to prevent even greater trauma from typhus. What they didn't fully understand was the psychological impact they were having on a population already traumatized to the breaking point. What they didn't fully understand was that the memory of being ordered to remove their clothing, the memory of being sprayed with white powder by a soldier whose intentions they couldn't comprehend, would stay with people for years, for decades, for the rest of their lives. What they didn't fully understand was that sometimes saving a life requires scarring at first. The military had made a decision. The delousing had to happen immediately. It had to happen to everyone. And it had to happen whether they understood it or agreed to it or even consented to it, because the alternative was mass death from typhus. The alternative was watching thousands of people die from a preventable disease. The alternative was failing in the basic humanitarian obligation to protect human life, even when that protection looked like violation. In the weeks that followed, Tomo recovered. The white powder had done its work. The lice had died. The threat of typhus began to recede. She watched as her body healed. The welts from the insect bites began to fade. Her hair began to grow back healthy. Her strength began to return. She was moved to a more stable refugee camp. She was given food. She was given medical care. And slowly, she began to heal. Her mother healed alongside her. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived the battle, survived 17 days in a cave, survived the trauma of delousing, survived the fear and the confusion and the terror. But the memory of that moment, of being ordered to remove her clothing, of the fear and confusion, of the white powder falling like snow, stayed with her. It became a story she told, a story about misunderstanding, a story about the cruelty of circumstance, a story about how salvation sometimes looks like violation until you understand the full context, a story that she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Years later, after the war had ended, after she had rebuilt her life in Saipan, after she had married and had children and grandchildren, Tomo would speak about Sergeant Edward Mitchell with something close to forgiveness, because she understood finally that he had been trying to save her, that his harshness was not cruelty, that his order to remove her clothing was not assault, that the white powder falling on her skin was not humiliation. It was medicine. It was life. It was hope in the form of a chemical that killed the invisible enemy that was consuming her from the inside out. She understood that he had been a young man, probably not much older than she was, who had been given an impossible task. The task of saving lives while traumatizing people. The task of being both healer and violator. The task of making decisions that were necessary but felt wrong. She understood that he had struggled with this just as much as she had, even if his struggle had been invisible to her in that moment. Edward Mitchell continued his work on Saipan. He deloused thousands of refugees before the war ended. He never knew if any of them understood what he was doing. He never knew if any of them forgave him for the trauma of that moment. He didn't know, in that moment, whether his actions would be remembered as saving lives or violating people. But he understood the mathematics of his work. For every person he deloused, he saved a life. For every moment of discomfort he inflicted, he prevented hours of suffering from typhus. For every person who cried in front of him, he prevented someone else from dying. After the war ended, Edward returned to the United States. He became a civilian again. He got married. He had children. He became a teacher. He spent the rest of his life helping young people understand history, understand science, understand the complexities of the human experience. But he never forgot Saipan. He never forgot the look in Tomo's eyes. He never forgot the feeling of doing something necessary that felt fundamentally wrong. The Battle of Saipan became a turning point in the Pacific War. The American military learned from it. They learned that disease could be as deadly as bullets. They learned that delousing protocols needed to be established immediately after surrender. They learned that compassion and efficiency, while often at odds, both mattered in the aftermath of war. They learned that sometimes the most merciful thing you can do looks like the cruelest thing in the moment. They learned these lessons at great cost, written in the suffering of thousands of people who had to choose between their dignity and their lives. The story of Tomo and Sergeant Edward Mitchell is not unique. It is one of countless moments in the aftermath of World War II, where soldiers and civilians had to navigate the impossible space between trauma and survival, where orders had to be followed even when those orders seemed to violate the very humanity they were meant to protect, where meaning had to be discovered after the fact, in reflection, in understanding, where forgiveness had to be learned, earned, and eventually granted. It's a story about context, about the difference between perception and reality, about how the same action can be experienced as violation by one person and salvation by another, depending on what information they possess, about how time can heal trauma and reveal truth, about how the people we fear are sometimes the people trying to save us, about how the people trying to save us sometimes have to inflict trauma in order to do so, about how humanity is complicated and messy and often impossible to judge from a single moment in time. Tomo survived Saipan. She rebuilt her life on the island she had never left. She opened a small business. She married. She became a teacher, just like she had dreamed. She lived to be 91 years old. And in her final years, she would speak about that moment with the American soldier, about the white powder, about the fear and confusion that turned into understanding. She would speak about it not as an act of cruelty, but as an act of pragmatic humanity, as an example of how even in the darkest moments of war, people can choose to save each other's lives, even when saving looks like something altogether different from what we expect. She would tell her grandchildren about the cave, about 17 days in the darkness, about the fear, about the soldier who ordered her to remove her clothing, about the white powder, about the confusion and the humiliation and the terror, and then she would tell them about the clothing, the clean clothing, the dignity that was restored, the life that was saved, and she would tell them that this was the real story of the war, not the glory of victory or the honor of combat, but the complicated, messy, sometimes heartbreaking reality of people trying to survive, of soldiers trying to save lives, of civilians trying to maintain their humanity in circumstances that tested it to the absolute limit. The white powder was DDT. The invisible enemy was typhus. The order to remove clothing was medical protocol, not assault. And Sergeant Edward Mitchell, a young American soldier on a devastated island, understood all of this. He understood it while making a decision that would traumatize a woman he would never speak to again. He understood that salvation is not always kind. It is often terrifying. It is often humiliating. It is often misunderstood. It is often the hardest thing both the Savior and the saved have to endure. But it is, always, worth the cost. This is the untold story of a single moment in World War II, a moment that changed the course of one woman's life, a moment that represents the thousands of moments like it, moments where humanity had to be restored one person at a time, even when that restoration looked like violation, even when it looked like cruelty, even when those who received the aid couldn't understand the gift they were being given. This is a story about what it means to be human in inhuman circumstances, what it means to choose mercy when cruelty is easier, what it means to make impossible decisions and live with the consequences. History is not always clear. It is not always clean. It is often a complicated mix of trauma, necessity, and unintended consequences. It is often full of moments where the right action looks wrong, where mercy looks like violation, where saving a life requires scarring at first. But it is always worth understanding, because in understanding these moments, we understand ourselves. We understand how to be human in inhuman circumstances. We understand how to save each other, even when saving looks like harm. We understand that the people we judge harshly in a moment might have been trying to help us all along. We understand that forgiveness and understanding often come much later, after we have had time to process, to learn, to grow. If this story moved you, if it made you think about history differently, if it reminded you that context matters, that compassion matters, that understanding matters, if it made you question your assumptions about the people you judge, the actions you condemn, the moments you witness without knowing their full context, then I ask you to do one thing. Please subscribe to this channel, because we tell stories like this, stories that are complicated, stories that are true, stories that matter, stories that challenge your understanding of the world and force you to think more deeply about the people involved. Subscribe and you'll never miss another moment that changes how you see the world. And if you liked this video, please give it a like. Leave a comment. Tell us what you think about this story. Tell us what it means to you. Tell us how it changed your perspective. Tell us about a time when you had to make a difficult decision. Tell us about a time when you were misunderstood. Tell us about a time when you later realized that someone was trying to help you all along. Because your voice matters, your perspective matters, your story matters. And in a world that often feels divided, your engagement reminds us that we are all connected by the stories we share, by the struggles we endure, by the difficult choices we make in impossible circumstances. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for taking the time to listen to the story of Tomo and Sergeant Edward Mitchell. Thank you for allowing yourself to be moved by it. Thank you for being willing to see the complexity in history. Thank you for being willing to consider multiple perspectives. Thank you for being willing to forgive, to understand, to grow. The world needs more people like you.